Bruins lack a true number one center, whether it be Pavel Zacha's ceiling not being that, certainly not Elias Lindholm's, or we're talking about exercising patience to see if one of the young kids like Fraser Minton, James Higgins, or Dean Letourneau can eventually become that. But what does that mean for this fall? Because Marco Sturm has to ice a team as the head coach that in his mind isn't just for developing young talent, but trying to get points in the here and now to make the playoffs, because that's his job. And we all understand that, and we can all appreciate that and respect that. So who is that player? Who is the Bruins number one center going to be heading into next year? Who plays best alongside David Pastrnak?
You're listening to the PuckUps Podcast. It's time to hit the ice with Brian DeFelice.
Welcome into episode 57 of the PuckUps Podcast. I am Brian DeFelice, and thank you all for joining me. On today's show, I want to talk about who should be the Boston Bruins' number one center entering next season. And also, what if the Bruins never acquired this legendary player? All of that and much more. But first things first, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the PuckUps on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that you get your podcast. And to get in touch with me or be a part of the show, you can email me, info@thepuckups.com. You can tweet at me on X at BrianDFelice_. You can tweet at the show at the PuckUps, or leave a comment on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, anywhere the show has a social media account and post content. To start things off today, I want to talk about the immediate future of the number one center ice position for the Boston Bruins. Now, we all here know that they lack a true number one center as we currently speak. Whether that's because Pavel Zacha's ceiling is not that, certainly not Elias Lindholm's, or we have to exercise patience to see if James Higgins or Fraser Minton or Dean Letourneau in time can grow into that role internally. But what does that mean for this fall? Because we all know and we can all appreciate that from Marco Sturm's perspective, while it would be great to both develop young kids on the fly and gain points in the standings simultaneously, that's best case scenario. But for him, his job as the head coach of the Bruins isn't strictly development. It is gaining points in the standings for the NHL team to make the playoffs. So who is that option? Is it Fraser Minton? Is it James Higgins in his first full season? Or is it Pavel Zacha, a guy that's in his prime that is more of a polished product, more of a finished product than the aforementioned options? So first things first, let's reset the table and hear what Kim Neely had to say about this when he and the Bruins ownership brass met with media after the season.
Kim, I'm curious about your insight in terms of the development of a number one center. So if I'd asked you about Bergeron maybe 3 years into his career, would he be a number one center? I'm not sure I would have had that answer. I'm not sure how you would have felt.
Right.
But here we've got Minton and Higgins as, I think, in terms of skill set, where they're sort of positioned, they could get there. Do you agree they have that skill set? And if they do, how do they get there?
I think they both have that skill set. They're both a little different players. One's more like Bergie as far as a 200-foot player and maybe not sees the ice as well as Higgins does. Higgins heads up all the time. Like, he's constantly looking to distribute. Fraser said to me at the exit meetings, he's like, wow, what a difference playoff hockey is compared to regular season hockey. So that experience for him was invaluable. He realizes how things close quicker. There's not as much time to do anything. Once he figures that out, like every player does over time, or most players do over time, I think he's going to grow and continue to grow. Whether they either become number one centers is up to them, and how that goes for them and what the path is for them. But we want to give these guys every opportunity to take a job that's staring at them. I mean, we all in this room recognize we don't have a true number one C, and that's something that we want to try to rectify, whether it's this off season or those guys growing into it. But it's something that we know that's needed.
Okay, so here's what strikes me first and foremost, hearing Cam's comments. When he says we all recognize right now we don't have a true number one C, to me, that speaks way more to what Pavel Zacha and Elias Lindholm aren't and can't be compared to what we all hope that one of James Higgins, Fraser Minton, or Dean Letourneau could be, right? Cam Neely is pretty much saying because Pavel Zacha is in his prime. Elias Lindholm is on the back half of his prime. So for Cam Neely to sit there in a press conference and say, while having those guys on their roster and in their prime, that we all know we don't have a true 1C. Well, is Pavel Zacha all of a sudden become a 1C, a true 1C in his 30s? Or Lindholm in his mid-30s? No. Those guys are what they are. So Cam Neely is saying, while knowing those guys are on their roster in their primes, that the team lacks a true 1C. So if those guys aren't a true 1C and you haven't traded for it and you're hoping it's possibly internal right now with either Higgins or Minton, then maybe we shouldn't be so quick. And I know a lot of you out there, you guys have given me your line projections or what you would do. And many of you have already penciled in Minton alongside Pastrnak. I've seen some pencil in Higgins. And I'm not saying I hate that. I do recognize that maybe for game one in his first full season, that's probably not as realistic as at least certainly Minton getting that spot, because Minton will be in his sophomore year, and he did play with Pastrnak much of last year at times, along with Husnudinov. So I could see that a lot quicker than I could see Higgins being in that position. Zacha, to me, is the interesting one. And I know that as we speak right now in the third week of July, that Zacha could still be traded, albeit very unlikely, I think, this offseason, or he could be extended. I don't know what's going to happen with his immediate future or long-term future with the Bruins, but right now we have to go under the assumption that he's on the team next season because he's under contract, right? So, and I think it's more likely he's extended than traded. So, but I digress. So when it comes to Zacha, I do think that penciling him in to center Pastrnak, who's a countryman and a good buddy of his, and they have played together at times. They played together the entirety of the record-breaking season, although Zacha was playing wing and Krejci was playing center on that line. They played together for much of the Centennial season, in particular the second half, I think, with Morgan Geekie. And that's kind of when Geekie first started to raise some eyebrows, but maybe this kid's actually a pretty good flyer that the Bruins took. And then the following couple of seasons, he's really proven that to be the case. The 24-25 season, once the Bruins brought in Elias Lindholm, you didn't see much David Pastrnak and Pavel Zacha 5-on-5 time, nor did you see that last season. So for the last 2 years, those two players, Zacha and Pastrnak, have been separated a lot at 5-on-5. And I've mentioned in recent episodes talking about Zacha that if I'm his camp, I don't want to extend right now with the Bruins, because if he is playing with Pastrnak 5-on-5 and special teams, pretty much all situations besides the PK, then he's going to have career highs again next year in point total. Now, is that because he's a true 1C, or is it a rub from one of the best wingers in the world? I think it's the latter. But regardless, Zacha's AAV is probably going to be a lot higher, or at least a little bit higher, if the Bruins have to extend him next year or next offseason as opposed to right now. So the Bruins, I'm sure, and Don Sweeney said as much, they want to extend Zacha. That's their goal. And it's definitely the Bruins' goal. If we take him at his word, it's the Bruins' goal to do that sooner than later because of the reasons that I just mentioned. And the Bruins know Zacha's ticket will only get more expensive next offseason. So all that being said, it makes sense why Zacha, the player, would want to play with Pastrnak, why his camp and representation would want him to play with Pastrnak. And also, for Marco Sturm, he's probably the most sure thing, high floor option this coming season for the Bruins, okay? But all of that said, let's jump back to Cam Neely's comments. He believes that Minton and Higgins have the skill set to be a number one center at the NHL level. Now, I don't know if he would say to the contrary regarding his own young players, But he did mention that they have much different skill sets, and he spoke to one of them having more of a Bergeron type skill set, and that's definitely unfair to call Minton. But we all know that anybody who's a good two-way player or has two-way skill set at center ice now until the end of time will just be compared to Bergeron, not in the sense of they can become Bergeron, but they model their game after Bergeron. So it's kind of like back in the day if somebody was a pure passer, right? They were a big setup player and had great hands and saw the game well. I'm sure people would, say, oh, this kid likes to model his game after, insert high-end player here, Gretzky or whomever. Back in, like, nobody would ever say that those players are going to become Gretzky, but how do you model your game after, right? And so if Cam Neely feels that Fraser Minton and or James Higgins have the skill set to be number one center. Dean Letourneau wasn't really mentioned in there, but Letourneau's another guy we're going to be seeing pretty soon too, and we'll see what he can do. But now as we sit here in June, and that press conference was back in April, or no, it was in early May. We now have seen the offseason unfold for much of it now. We've seen the draft come and go. We've seen free agency come, and it's still there's still some players out there who could be signed, of some notable players, but I don't know if I don't think any of them really are bound for Boston. So we know the Bruins to this point have not traded for an external center, true number one center, because that was unlikely from the start. So does Cam Neely, does he want to see Fraser Minton get a look at number one center? Does Don Sweeney? Does Marco Sturm? Not that they don't want to see James Higgins get that, but I think everybody's probably on the same page. I know there could be a couple of comments on this video saying to the contrary, but I think most people in that Bruins organization aren't going to pencil in James Higgins to center David Pastrnak right away. It could happen at some point throughout the season, especially with injuries. You just never know what happens, or just player performance. I feel like the Bruins are probably going to start Higgins on the wing. Now, I want him at center, and if it's only for a couple of weeks or a month that he's at wing, whatever. But in any event, I do think the Bruins are looking at their top two centers heading into next year is Pavel Zacha and Fraser Minton. Now, which order that is, I don't know. And that's kind of why I posed the question to you all. Who should that be? If I had my way, if I were coaching that team, I would do Minton. And I would spread out some of the proven veteran talent in that top six, right? I would probably do Minton, centering Peterka and Pastrnak. I don't think they brought in Peterka to play him on the third line or on a line without Pastrnak. I think they want those two players to play together. So I think that could be a good top line. And the key word is could, right? Because it'll be up to Fraser Minton to really take that opportunity and run with it and try to avoid any major sophomore slumps and continue to grow his game. Now, playing alongside Pastrnak and Peterka should give him some really good opportunities to gather some points. But that's a line I could see the Bruins starting off with if they were willing to be a little bit more risky than certain. And that's not to put anything against Minton. I just think that we all here can agree that Zacha is probably he's the more polished player to this point. He's the safer play. And that's kind of why I'm advocating against it, because I'm not worried about the Bruins just barely sneaking into the playoffs next year. I do kind of want all of it. I want them to make the playoffs, but I want to see what you have in some young players. Like, not just young players, your future. These are your core future players in Minton and Higgins. So I would go with the top line of Minton, Pastrnak, and Peterka. And this is right now in July. Maybe my opinion will change as we go along here. I'm sure it will. But that's what I would start off with. And then for my second line, I would do Zacha, centering Higgins, and maybe Geekie, right? And in that situation, you can get Higgins playing, taking some draws when Zacha gets kicked out, because it happens every shift in the NHL. Players get kicked out of draws all the time. And, Zacha could be somebody that Higgins could learn from, because you can say what you want about Zacha and how he's not a true number one center. And from a point production standpoint, that's true. but he's a good player, right? Even his detractors would admit he's a good player. He's a sound player, plays the game the right way, plays two ways. He leaves a lot to be desired at times in terms of his finish, although last year would spit in the face of that argument. But also, he's not the most assertive guy in the corners or whatever, but not every player is. Still, the details of Zacha's game are pretty strong. And I do think that Higgins could learn alongside him and kind of share some duties with him in all three zones, but in particular the D zone and stuff like that. So that could be a pretty good second line. Okay, so that's to me, that's the compromise of Higgins not playing center. He's not going to play center right away. I want him in the top six. The last place I want Higgins is third line wing. I don't want him playing third line wing with Elias Lindholm centering or something like that, right? So just to reiterate, maybe your top line is Minton centering Peterka and Pastrnak, and your second line is Zacha centering Higgins and Geeky. And then your third line, I would have maybe Husnudinov centering, I guess it's maybe Lindholm and Middlestad for right. I mean, this is the roster that we currently know, right? Do I love that line? No. I like Husnudinov at center. That's kind of my consultation prize. Middlestad, I don't have anything against him. He just doesn't really do it for me long-term for the Bruins, but he's under contract for another year, and unless he's traded, he's on the team, right? So, and then with Elias Lindholm, if he's in the lineup, I don't want him in the top six. And, you know, he can take draws. He can share some, you know, even if Lindholm centered that line and Lindholm was centering Middlestad and Husnudinov, I mean, whatever. But it's a third line I'm not totally in love with because of the Lindholm factor, but he can take draws and whatnot. So, and then your fourth line, you know, I would like to see Matt Patra in this lineup too. So maybe you have Patra centering Kastelik and Zdeno, and Corrali's your veteran extra forward who can slot into the lineup here and there and just be a good Samaritan, be a good pro, and understand that the Bruins have some younger options and he needs to do his best to mentor them. And that's where he is at this point in his career. Now there's some moving parts here. I'm open to other options. Maybe at some point Higgins and Zacha flip and Higgins is centering Zacha and Geeky, and, you know, Patra moves up to the third line and it's Patra and Husnudinov and Lindholm and Middlestad's traded. I don't know. There's clearly a lot of moving pieces with this team, and it's hard for me to comment completely on. But I do think Cam Neely's comments there strike me as somebody who does not believe, and rightfully so, that Pavel Zacha or Elias Lindholm are a true number one center. So if that's the case, and you're acknowledging that your team still needs that, and you could have that internally with Higgins or Minton, then why not give them a chance to start next season? And if Minton was somebody who was an irresponsible player or an immature player, then there's a huge argument to be made for Zacha. But Minton is not immature and he's not irresponsible. The big question mark with Minton is, what can he do offensively? What can his offensive ceiling be? And playing alongside Pastrnak and Peterka, yeah, there's pressure there to perform, but man, I feel like any one of us could go out there with Pastrnak on our wing and put up, 45 points. So I think Minton, if he played with those guys all year long at 5-on-5 and you sprinkle in some power play time for him too on the second unit or whatever, then I think you're talking about a guy who should be at least able to score 50, 55 points. And for a sophomore season, right, we'll take that. Is it true 1C production? No, but don't lose sight of what next season is supposed to be for the Bruins. Make the playoffs if you can, great. But it's more important for the Bruins to continue to be developing and trending upwards. I might be in the minority here, okay? But if my options are, hey, Brian, would you rather the Bruins not play any of the young kids all year and they make the playoffs by 1 point and lose in the first round in 4 games to Florida? Or would you rather the Bruins miss the playoffs on game 84 by a point, but you know what? They played Hagens all year. They played Patra all year. They played Minton and Husnudinov, and all those players took steps, and they all produced pretty well for their age and their experience in the NHL. And the team just barely missed the playoffs, but they're trending really well. Like, they're looking good. I would rather take that. Now, the best case scenario is that the latter happens, but they still make the playoffs, and that could happen. If you have David Pastrnak putting up 110 points again, 100 to 110 points, and JJ Peterka puts up 65 to 75, and Zacha gives you 60 to 65, and Geekie gives you 60 to 65. He had 68 points last year. If those guys can do that, and then your Minton and your Husnadinovs can give you, well, my bar for Minton's higher, because I think that he'll be put in a situation more consistently to maybe play alongside Pastrnak. So if you can have Minton putting up 45 to 55 points, if Hagens can come in and give you 30 to 40 points, if Husnadinov can give you 30 to 40 points, that's pretty good. That's pretty good scoring depth throughout your lineup. And it's not the sexiest roster on paper. If Elias Lindholm is healthy, he should be able to give you 40 points. And it's not crazy, and it's not justifying his contract right now. But, hey, 40 points is 40 points. I mean, he's given the Bruins that at least in his first 2 seasons. Casey Middlestat can give you 40 points if he's still here. So I do think that this Bruins team can score by committee, heavily relied on by David Pastrnak at the top. But this is what I want to see. This is what I want to see. And I do want to see Hagens get time at center. But if it's not in the top 6, I don't know if I want him playing. I mean, I don't mind him playing center just to do it, to get the reps. But if Hagens is playing center on a third line because they want Minton and Zacha ahead of him right now, which honestly, I think we can all understand, at least right now, then I don't want Elias Lindholm anchoring him down, or, I don't know. But then again, who knows? Nobody saw the Zacha Middlestat Arvidsson combo clicking the way that it did last year. Maybe a third line of Hagens centering Middlestat and Lindholm could be a good line. Like who knows? So I'm not thrilled about Lindholm playing with Hagens in that situation, but you just never know. If he's healthy, he could be a good veteran presence on the wing and teach Hagens what he knows how to, what he knows in the faceoff circle, and kind of be a reliable winger for Hagens if things go wrong at times. And then in that situation, you have Husnadinov somewhere in the top 6, maybe in place of whoever Hagens was in my original line. So there's options. There's options, but as much as I want Hagens playing center, I just don't see the Bruins going Minton Hagens 1-2 to start next year. Like, one of those guys, if Zacha's on this team next year, Zacha is ahead of one of those guys in the depth chart. They're not going to demote Zacha to third line center. They're just not going to do it. So in that situation, you have to imagine it's either Minton or Hagens that's playing with Pastrnak if Zacha's not. And I think at this point it's going to be Minton. So now you slide Zacha down to the second line. And as much as I'd like to see Hagens get reps at center, I'd rather him in a top 6. I'd rather him playing with better talent right now. So if that means that he's on Zacha's wing, or Zacha's with Pastrnak and he's on Minton's wing, we'll iron out these details, and it'll all play out in front of us. That's the beauty of sports, is we can speculate all we want, but at some point we'll get our answers. So I'm curious to all of you, what would you prefer the Bruins center depth chart realistically look like entering next season based on the players that are currently rostered and in the organization? And I challenge you all to truly think about this realistically. I don't want this to be fantasy booking. Okay, like because I can already see the comments coming now, and it's not that I totally disagree with them, right? But I can already see some comments now saying, go Minton, Hagens, Patra up the middle. It's like, okay, or Hagens, Minton, Patra. And it's like, okay, I'm not saying I would hate that. I'm for younger players getting their opportunities, but that's a world that's being painted where now Elias Lindholm and Pavel Zacha are both being, moved to the wing. And for a player in Patra who's been in Providence for the majority of the last 2 years, and James Higgins, who I love him as a player and prospect, but he has to still get his first real reps at the NHL level. So I just don't see those two players pushing, a 60-point center iceman in Zacha, who's 29 years old and in his prime, to the wing right away. And Elias Lindholm, I do think, could play wing right away, but I don't see him and Zacha both playing wing for those three young kids to be your 1, 2, 3 options up the middle, because there's a lack of experience there, and the Bruins just won't do that. So I'm not trying to, piss on your Cheerios here, but like when you do this exercise, if you put the comments, below, try to remember the situation that Marco Sturm is in. Marco Sturm is not going to go 1, 2, 3 up the middle with 3 kids that are 22 years of age and younger. He's just not going to do it, because his job is to be fair to him. It's to make the playoffs and develop at the same time. Sure. But we got to be realistic. So realistically, what would you like your center ice depth to look like for the Bruins next year? At least to start. Okay. And I'll read those comments. And on my next episode, I'm going to be doing a mailbag. So I'll try to respond to those then. Now, for the second part of this episode, I want to get to another what if scenario that you, the listeners, have sent in. And this one comes from Edward Lyons on YouTube. And Edward says, what if the Bruins had not brought in Zdeno Chara? Just a thought of it makes me shiver. Now, Edward, this is a great what if scenario. And truly, the last 20 years of Bruins hockey, as we've come to know it, would have never been, simply put. And the last 20 years of Bruins hockey has truly been one of the greatest stretches in the franchise's 100-plus year history. Now, that doesn't mean it's come without its fair share of heartbreak, but so is being a sports fan. And there's a famous saying out there that it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And that's kind of how I feel about all of the heartbreak and torture that Bruins fans have been through the last 20 plus years with this team, because there are fan bases out there that haven't made the playoffs more than once or twice in that same span, or haven't won a playoff series or gone to a conference final. And, Bruins fans understand that too, because there's been stretches of time where the Bruins didn't go very far or qualify for playoffs. Like when the Bruins went to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2011 against the Lightning, that was the Bruins' first Eastern Conference Finals appearance since 1990. Or maybe 91. But it had been a while. It was like 20 years. And same thing when they went to the finals that year. And then when they won the cup, it was their first cup in 39 years. So as much heartbreak as there has been, right? Scott Walker's double overtime goal in 2009 in Game 7. The Flyers coming back from down 3-0 to beat the Bruins in not just the series, but in Game 7 also being down 3-0. It was all worth it because the Bruins won the cup in 11. And then, yes, we had the heartbreak of 2013 and 2019, all that stuff in 2023. And the list goes on. But again, the ups and downs is the nature of being a sports fan. And newsflash, there's a lot more downs, not just for the Bruins, but for every organization out there than there are ups. Only one team wins a championship every single year. And I think in New England, we've been a little bit spoiled, to say the least, by all the Patriots' success since the early 2000s, and even the Red Sox, who they've been as hot and cold can be throughout the last 15, 20 years, but they've got 4 World Series to show for it. The Celtics have a couple of titles, but the Celtics also have a couple of finals losses in that same time. The Red Sox have not lost a World Series, but the Patriots have lost, three Super Bowls? They lost to, the Giants twice and the Eagles, right? So, it happens. It happens. But anyway, back to Edward's question here. What if the Bruins had not brought in Zdeno Chara? Okay. This butterfly effect, to be completely honest, is way too big and way too extensive to comb through entirely and accurately go through. I'll start with the abstract, and that is, if the Bruins had not brought in Zdeno Chara, simply put, they don't win the Stanley Cup in 2011. I'm 99.9% sure of that. And the 0.01% of me, I'll explain in a few minutes here. The other butterfly effect of this is that Patrice Bergeron is probably named captain of the Bruins far earlier than he was. And you're probably talking about him being the captain of the Boston Bruins for, 12 to 15 years instead of the 2 that it was. So let's go back to the summer of 2006, and that's when the Bruins did sign Zdeno Chara. Now, there's an article in the Boston Globe by Kevin Paul DuPont some years back, and it was about the offseason that almost was for Zdeno Chara in 2006. And many of you may not know this. I didn't know this either until I was looking it up recently. But Zdeno Chara was, if not a Boston Bruin, almost a Los Angeles King. Chara signed a 5-year, $7.5 million contract, I believe, with the Bruins back in the summer of 2006. And the Kings were reportedly offering Chara even more money than the Bruins. But Chara wanted to go to Boston, wanted to live there, wanted to raise a family there. And if we're being truthful, probably saw the vacancy that the organization had for a presence like him. So if he hadn't signed in Boston, though, he probably signs with the Kings. So what does that mean for the Bruins? Well, that means that the Bruins, he could have re-signed in Ottawa too or signed elsewhere. But the point is, if Chara's not a Bruin, he could be a King or somewhere else. But that means the Bruins didn't get their big prized fish on the back end. And while they still can bring in Marc Savard this summer, which let's assume that they did, the Bruins bringing in Chara wasn't just simply bringing in a need on the left side of their blue line. What the Bruins were in need of organizationally was a culture change, and a massive one. They had traded away Joe Thornton less than a year prior to this. They bring in Marco Sturm and Wayne Primo and Brad Stewart in that trade, which we all know is on its face one of the most lopsided trades in hockey history because Thornton was in the middle of an MVP season. But what that did for the Bruins was they traded away their captain. And even though it was a bad trade on paper, it opened up a captaincy vacancy and a leadership vacancy that Chara wanted to come in and fill. And the Bruins wanted Chara to come in and fill. And so the Bruins were bringing in a guy to not just help their team on the ice, but to help their organization off the ice and completely change how the league viewed the Boston Bruins. And that's exactly how it played out. Even though the 06-07 season didn't go great for the Bruins, they had their second straight 13th place finish in the Eastern Conference. The fabric was starting to be laid down a little bit, right? And then the following year, they bring in Claude Julien, and that kind of started the real era of Bruins hockey after that of being a consistent playoff team and a contender, not in the 07-08 season, but beyond that. So if Chara didn't sign in Boston, I have to imagine the Bruins would have still been looking for not the impact of Chara, because there's only one Zdeno Chara, not just in the free agency class of 06, but in the league's history. They would have tried to supplement that need elsewhere. And two names that come to my mind that were UFAs in the summer of 06 that were available for the Bruins are Rob Blake and Ed Jovanovski. Now, at the time in 06, Chara was 29 years old, okay? Ed Jovanovski was 30, and Rob Blake was a grizzled vet at the age of 37. And he signed a short-term deal with the Kings. So there's a bit of a correlation there. The Kings wanted Chara, they got Rob Blake. If the Kings got Chara and the Bruins wanted Chara, do the Bruins pivot to Rob Blake on a short-term deal? Maybe. Maybe. I mean, again, Rob Blake was far past his prime, but could he have been a guy that came in for a couple of years, worn a C, and tried to help the Bruins get their culture back on the tracks a little bit with a young player like Patrice Bergeron in the wings to be the captain in a couple of years? It's possible. I mean, if they lost out on Chara, beggars can't be choosers. The Bruins looking at themselves saying, okay, we lost out on Chara, but we're still bringing in Savard and Rob Blake. So maybe they go the Rob Blake route. I think, however, they probably, if given their preference, would have gone the route of Ed Jovanovski. Ed Jovanovski was a first-round pick, or first overall pick, I should say, in 1994. Spent some time with the Panthers and the Canucks. And just to be clear, none of these guys, Blake, as good as Blake was in his career was, he's not Chara, but hell of a player. Nobody was Chara the way Chara was a unicorn in the league's history, especially in his prime. So that's not disrespect to Rob Blake. And Ed Jovanovski certainly would not have had the impact that Chara had on the Bruins, but he would have been a good left shot ad. Again, only a year older than Chara at the time, and a pretty, reliable two-way defenseman, good locker room presence, good grizzled guy. And so maybe the Bruins pivot and bring in Ed Jovanovski and Mark Savard instead of Mark Savard and Zdeno Chara. Now, Jovanovski signed a 5-year deal with an AAV of $6.5 million with the Phoenix Coyotes at the time. So the Bruins signed Chara to a 6-year, $7.5 million deal in AAV. And Jovanovski, I imagine, would have been the same ticket he signed in Phoenix, which would have been 5 years, $6.5 million AAV. So again, similar age, similar contracts, and you would have had Jovanovski into his mid-30s and would have been more part of that next immediate and interim future than Rob Blake would have been. And I think the Bruins would have preferred Jovanovski's youth and playing style at that point. So had the Bruins not brought in Chara, my guess is they would have pivoted to Rob Blake or Jovanovski. And I'm going to say Jovanovski just based on the contract similarity and age similarity that he and Chara had that summer. And I could see the Bruins saying, okay, we lost out on Chara, but Jovanovski's a good guy to bring in too. So now let's go into that following season, because this is where it gets kind of interesting. So in the 06-07 season, even though the Bruins had Chara, they finished 23rd in the NHL, and they had the 8th overall pick in that draft. With the 8th overall pick, they drafted Zach Hamill. And actually, I had a what if question about what if the Bruins didn't draft Zach Hamill and instead drafted Logan Couture, who went one pick after Hamill. But I'll keep it to this one for now. But I will also shout out, beyond Logan Couture, the Bruins also could have drafted. This is a different conversation, because even with the draft pick, the Bruins did have 8th overall. They also could have drafted Ryan McDonough, who went after Hamill, Kevin Shattenkirk, PK Subban, and Jamie Benn. Those are all notable impact players in the NHL, certainly in their primes, that the Bruins still could have drafted over Zach Hamill. However, to be fair to the Bruins, I'm pretty sure Jamie Benn went in the 5th round. Subban was in the 3rd round. Like, a lot of teams passed on these guys. So it's just another example of, it's always easier being a Monday morning quarterback in terms of drafting. If people knew what these players are going to turn out to be, then I'm sure none of these players would have gone when they went. But I digress. So in the 07 draft, based on the results of the 06-07 season, the Flyers finished last in the league. Phoenix, with Ed Jovanovski, finished 29th. There was only 30 teams back then. The LA Kings, with Rob Blake, who signed with the Kings instead of after leaving Colorado, they finished 28th. And then the Capitals finished 27th. The Blackhawks 26th. The Oilers 25th. The Blue Jackets 24th. And the Bruins 23rd. Now, the Chicago Blackhawks had the 5th worst record in the league that year, and they won the the draft lottery, jumping all the way up to the first overall pick where they drafted Patrick Kane. So here's where it's interesting. Looking back now, the first overall pick ended up going to the team who finished 5th worst in the league, being 26th in the NHL standings out of 30 teams with 71 points. The Bruins finished 8th worst in the league, 23rd overall, with 76 points. So, if the Bruins did not draft Zdeno Chara, or I'm sorry, draft him, if they didn't sign him as a UFA in 06, the best case scenario for the Bruins is that somehow, some way, they end up being 5 points worse, and somehow, some way, they end up with the 5th worst record in the league, which ends up being the spot to win the lottery and draft Patrick Kane. Now, I'm going to say this right now. Had the Bruins not signed Chara, and say they signed Rob Blake or Ed Jovanovski, they very, 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 very likely would not have finished the 5th worst record and ended up winning the lottery and draft Patrick Kane. That's not the most likely outcome, okay? But I can't sit here and say it would have been impossible because they were only separated by 5 points. And if the Bruins don't have Chara and they have Blake or Jovanovski, like they could have been 5 points worse than they were. It's possible. But it's hard to predict how the other teams would, like Chicago. Would Chicago still have had 71 points? I don't know. Did the Bruins and the Blackhawks go head-to-head that year? I think they did. I think the Bruins actually beat them in Chicago. But in any event, so let's just go with the Patrick Kane scenario for a second here, okay? Let's keep in mind that prior to the 2007 draft, hell, even prior to signing Zdeno Chara, the Bruins had already drafted in their system Milan Lucic, David Krejci, Brad Marchand. They already had Patrice Bergeron and Phil Kessel. So signing Chara had no impact on the Bruins drafting those players. They already had those players in their system. So theoretically, if the Bruins didn't sign Chara and they ended up not finishing 26th in the league with 76 points, maybe they finished a little bit worse, 5th in the league with 71 or thereabouts, and maybe they draft Patrick Kane. Well, now you're talking about a Bruins core where you have Patrick Kane, Patrice Bergeron, Phil Kessel, eventually David Krejci, eventually Brad Marchand, eventually Milan Lucic, Marco Sturm, Mark Savard, Glenn Murray, Brad Boyes is probably still there for a little bit. So this is the best case scenario. Again, I'm going to say that a million times in this episode just so we all understand. This is probably not the case that happens, but I can't say it's impossible. So their forward core here going forward would be incredible, right? It would be incredible. On the back end, you have to imagine they still have Tim Thomas in goal, but on the blue line, if they missed out on Chara and went the Rob Blake route, their future blue line is, not looking great at all. They really have no identity. And if they had Jovanovski back there, then, I guess he leads a blue line that, do they still bring in Dennis Weidman? Do they still bring in Aaron Ward and Andrew Ferentz and, guys like that? Andrew Alberts is still there, I guess. So the Bruins blue line and their identity would have never been what it was with Chara if they didn't sign Chara. But in a very, 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 very far away land, it's possible that in the 06-07 season, they end up finishing with 4 or 5 less points than they do. And maybe they're the team to finish 5th worst in the league. And that's the number that ended up drafting 1st overall. And I don't think they'd be drafting Zach Campbell over Patrick Kane in that situation. He was the undisputed 1st overall pick. Alternatively, maybe the Bruins finish a little bit worse and than 8th overall without Chara, and they don't get Patrick Kane, but maybe they get James Van Riemsdyk or Kyle Turris, one of those guys who went in the top 5. But neither of those guys would have changed the Bruins' fortunes the way that Patrick Kane could have done. So the most likely scenario here is that the Bruins don't sign Chara. They sign Blake or Jovanovski, and maybe they finish around where they did, which is the 8th worst team in the league in 06-07, maybe 7th worst, maybe 6th worst, and they don't draft Patrick Kane, and they probably don't draft anybody else that is much of a needle mover. And we can't sit here and say, oh, well, maybe they would have drafted Ryan McDonough or Logan Couture or PK Subban, because you know what? Or Kevin Shattenkirk, because they could have drafted those guys with 8th overall, which is a pick that they did have in reality. So now let's move ahead to the 07-08 season, where the Bruins do not draft Patrick Kane, and they do not have Zdeno Chara as a free agent add from a few years prior. This team, they probably are, a lottery team. They're probably a bottom 5 team in a league, or certainly bottom 10. They do not make the playoffs like they did in the 07-08 season. I guess they do hire Claude Julien still. I can't say they wouldn't have hired Claude. I just think at that point, Chara's presence and was so large, no pun intended, on that Bruins team that Claude Julien's system was heavily dependent on Zdeno Chara being who he was on the ice, and Tim Thomas becoming a great story later in his career. And I just think that Bruins team, they don't make the playoffs. I mean, they needed everything to go right just to make the playoffs that year, and they had Chara. Now, granted, Bergeron got hurt, and they were without him pretty much the whole season, but they make the playoffs that year, and they're drafting in the mid-teens. If they don't have Chara, I have to imagine that they're a bottom 10 team, maybe even a bottom 5 team. And best case scenario then is maybe you end up being the team to draft Steven Stamkos or Drew Doughty. Instead, they draft Joe Colburn, 16th overall. Erik Karlsson went 1 pick before Colburn. After Colburn, Jordan Eberle went, John Carlson went, Roman Josi went 38th overall. So the Bruins still could have had those guys. But if there was no Chara, and if they didn't win the lottery the year afterwards and draft Patrick Kane, I think they're probably a bottom 10 team. And even then, there's no guarantees that they draft Stamkos or Doughty. And then, beyond that, I think also Alex Pietrangelo was also drafted that year. I think maybe 4th or 5th overall. So obviously Drew Doughty would have been a huge game changer if the Bruins could have drafted him. And certainly Steven Stamkos, but I'm talking Doughty because, he plays the same position as Chara on the back end. But I don't know. Because then beyond that, the Bruins in 2010, they had the 2nd overall pick, so they drafted Sagan. But yeah, I would say without signing Chara, the Bruins definitely don't become the big bad Bruins for about 15 years. They do not win a cup in 2011, and the last 20 years as we know it never happens. Just doesn't happen. And maybe they're a playoff team here and there, and maybe they go on a run here and there at some point, somehow, some way. Because, they, as I said, they did draft Bergeron, Marchand, Lucic, Krejci, Kessel, all those guys before Chara was even signed. So, and they did bring in Savard still. The Savard contract isn't impacted by Chara not signing. If anything, it's just more money to spend, obviously. So I think the Bruins would still go on to have a pretty good forward core, but their identity in that era was being a very well structured defensive team, an intimidating team, and Chara was he was the poster child for that. So worst case, if the Bruins don't sign Chara, they continue to have a lack of identity, and they have some talent up front over the years, but they can't establish their back end really ever, and they just don't win a cup, and they're just a mediocre team. Maybe a couple good years, a couple bad years, and some in between. but I can't say that there's a cup in that future at all. If somehow they got lucky enough to draft Patrick Kane or Drew Doughty or Steven Stamkos, then yes, I think those players are impactful enough, even without Chara, where the Bruins would have looked different. But you add one of those players, you add either Stamkos or Doughty or Patrick Kane, you add one of those guys to a core that you had already drafted in Bergeron, Krejci, Lucic, Marchand, Kessel, and a Mark Savard that you brought in too, and you have some other guys like Marco Sturm who you brought in via trade and some other good veterans along the way. Could you have built around that type of team and maybe won a cup? Maybe, but they would have had to have been very, very lucky to get one of those guys. And I can't sit here in sincerity and say they would have, because they probably wouldn't have. But if they did, then yes, the Bruins could have survived the next 15, 20 years without Chara and maybe could have been a contender, but they would have looked different. They may have been a contender like how Chicago got there, which was a lot of, high-end skill. They wouldn't have been the big bad Bruins. They would have been a different type of team. But what we do know is that they did sign Chara and they did win a cup. And there's been a lot of, suffering and pain and agony over the years as a Bruins fan, but we have 2011 forever. And I can talk about hypothetical situations all we want here, which is the fun of the what ifs. And I think the most likely scenario is that the Bruins don't sign Chara and they don't draft one of those high impact players as a result of it, because they're not as, I don't know if they just get lucky enough to draft Kane or Stamkos or Doughty, but maybe they do. But it's more likely that they don't. And if they don't have Chara or one of those guys, I think you're left with, pretty much the Bruins core that we came to know, but no Chara. And, then it's like, okay, so what do they do in like ensuing free agencies? Do they go, do they try to have a huge hockey trade at some point? Do they try to establish another UFA the following year or two to supplement what they missed out on Chara? Like, who knows how it would have played out completely, but I think I've tried my best here to answer this what if in the immediate, what the Bruins would have tried to respond, and some of the scenarios that could have played out if they did. And but obviously it's an impossible situation to completely play out here, but it's fun to think about. It really is fun to think about. And I appreciate the scenario, Edward, and you guys let me know. Again, it's difficult to accurately do this, but let me know if I'm kind of on the right track, right? Like, if the Bruins don't sign Chara, they probably try to, change course to Jovanovski or Rob Blake, right? And then it's like, okay, so if they don't finish 8th overall, if they don't have Chara the following year, do they still finish 8th overall, or do they finish a little bit worse? And as I said, the 5th place team from the bottom won the lottery. Chicago was the 5th worst team. They won the lottery. It was Patrick Kane. The Bruins missed that spot by 5 points with Chara. So how does it play without him? Anyway, fun question. I'm glad the Bruins did sign Chara, as we all are. But that'll do it for this episode. Thank you all very much for listening, and I will talk to you on Friday.